All right, everyone. I'm here with Robert Sikes. Robert, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So tell us about your journey through health and body composition and fitness and keto, because I know you have a really great story. So I'd love to start there.
Yeah, so I got into bodybuilding when I was in high school. I was like a junior in high school. I weighed 115 pounds. I was scrawny, and I just wanted to get bigger to impress the girls or whatever. I don't know. But I didn't have a clue what I was doing. Dove into it full speed ahead. Did the crazy bulking and cutting phases. Got up to 230 pounds, which was way too big for me. I'm like 5'7", so 230 pounds is not a good look. Lost a ton of weight. Lost like 80 pounds in 12 weeks for my first show. Did that all very unhealthy with a standard, diet, lots of carbs, lots of rice, chicken and rice, eating every 2 or 3 hours. And then I developed a bunch of eating disorders and was looking for a healthier alternative and stumbled upon keto by accident back in 2015. And I pretty much haven't looked back since. It's been a wonder for me it's helped me recover from the disordered eating tendencies. It's helped with my bodybuilding endeavors. I earned my pro card in 2017. And I just am super passionate about the ketogenic diet and lifestyle, especially from a natural bodybuilding perspective.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so what do you do now with the keto diet? Because I believe you're a coach and I know you have some products. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that too?
Yeah, so I coach. I've coached, I don't know, 500 or so people over the years, all with ketogenic approach. I'm just passionate about sharing the information I've learned for people that are wanting to compete and do so in a healthy way, but also just people that are wanting to improve their health and composition. I actually had a client call today with somebody who's been struggling with disordered eating tendencies, has kind of done a lot of the same things that I used to struggle with. So being able to pay it forward and give back to that community is something I'm super passionate about. In 2017, when I did my competition prep with a ketogenic approach, I developed a Keto Brick, which is basically a 1,000 calorie shelf stable ketogenic meal replacement bar. And at the time, there wasn't any products in the market, that answered those macros that I needed. So my girlfriend at the time, wife now, we just kind of rolled up our sleeves and got into the food product business. And lo and behold, there was a lot of demand for this thing, and it just kind of took off. So we do that a lot now. We have a warehouse space here. We make all the keto bricks in house, manufacture them in house. Do the coaching, do the podcasting, do a lot of content creation. That's pretty much my day to day.
Awesome. And so tell us about the keto brick. Like who's your target audience or market for the keto brick? Because if it's 1,000 calories, I would assume that it's not for the average Joe looking to lose weight on a ketogenic diet, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, so a lot of people don't eat the whole brick in one sitting. I do, but a lot of people will cut them up into smaller portion sizes or melt them into smaller, like little ice cube tray molds, little silicone molds, and portion it out to like 100 calorie portions. So a lot of people do that, but basically it's just a really high quality fat source. So people that are having a hard time finding fats, quality fats to implement into their ketogenic diets, the brick is made primarily from cacao butter, which is a really good source of stearic acid. So people that are wanting that high quality fat source will make it easier by using something like a brick. That way they don't have to just consume a bunch of MCT oil and have a bunch of dehydrated stress doing that.
Yeah. And I can definitely think about several clients of mine who are sort of underweight or for whom the keto diet has really suppressed their appetite a lot. Do you see this too, where it's like, you see a lot of the clients, it's like, I just don't have that much of an appetite. I feel like I'm not eating that much. And then some of them are losing weight when that's not their primary goal.
Yeah, so a lot of people eat way too much food. That's a big problem out there right now. But what doesn't really get talked about that often is the other end of the spectrum, which people are chronically under eating. And the ketogenic diet does have a very satiating effect, especially when they have a higher fat approach to begin with. They'll have this stabilization in their hunger hormones, and they won't eat nearly enough. They'll just not find themselves being hungry. They'll drop calories inadvertently. They'll have a down regulation of their metabolic rate, and they'll start tracking. They'll find out they're only consuming 1,200 calories or less, which is just not enough calories. So having ways to make getting that intake in easier, more efficiently, so they don't have the negative effects that come with chronically undereating for too long is something that I've really been trying to get information out there about for sure.
Yeah, that's great. Can you talk to us about some of those negative effects of chronic undereating and what that might look like? So you mentioned like 1,200 calories a day. Maybe we can start with what could sort of look what could fall under the category of chronic undereating?
Yeah, so the ketogenic diet, the primal diet, the diet that everybody's doing right now. It's great. There's a lot of biohackers in the space. With that, there's been a lot of talk around intermittent fasting, extended fasting, and I'm all for that. That's all great, but there's a point in which you can overdo things, and I feel like a lot of people have gotten so fixated on fasting for so long that they do it too much, too frequently. And fasting is great, but it can be done to an extreme. And if you're fasting too frequently, also in the context of not eating enough when you do feast, then you're just stressing the body out too much. I mean, being in a caloric deficit is a stressor on the body. Being in an extended fast is a stressor on the body. There can be a hormetic effect to that. But if you're doing it too frequently, too long, too often, you're going to have more of an adverse effect than not. And that can take the form of down regulation in your metabolic rate, some hormonal dysregulation. You're certainly not going to optimize for building and retaining lean muscle tissue if you're chronically under eating. So really just trying to hedge against those adverse effects and making sure that you have a balance to that period of lower calories is very important.
Yeah, that's great information. And I see this very frequently in my practice. I'll see someone who's been doing a 2 meal a day all the time. That's like how they always eat. And I can see this, especially in women, that they can tend to plateau there. So it's not that 2 meals a day will cause you to plateau, but I see a lot of women who are stuck in a plateau and that's their pattern. So what might you say, what might be some things that you would look at if someone came to you and they're like, I eat 2 meals a day, I'm in ketosis most of the time, but I have this really big stall. What areas might you look at to start to sort of get to the root of it?
Yeah. So if they're eating 2 meals a day and those 2 meals are 1,500 calories each, that's okay. That's pretty much what I do. I eat about 1,500 calories per meal, 3,000 plus calories a day. And that's fine. But if you're eating 1,500 or if you're eating 2 meals a day and it's like just trace amounts of like little snick snacks and not good enough, not enough food, then you're not going to be feeding your body appropriately. I mean, the recommendation for a 6-month-old infant is like, I don't know, 600, 800 calories or something like that. So there's adults that are eating that little, especially if they're doing like protein sparing modified fast, they're eating like 400, 500 calories a day. That's just not enough for the human body to be able to thrive and optimize with, especially if you're doing any form of resistance training or you're very active at all. So having a good sit down conversation, talking about what their current biomarkers are, talking about what their current hormonal levels are, seeing what their energy levels are like, seeing what their hunger levels are like, and then knowing where to go from there is very important. I get so many clients, males as well, but you see this a lot in females, that have just been wanting to lose weight for 10 plus years. And they've just been inundated with this, calories in, calories out, eat less mentality, to the point where they've downregulated their metabolism so much so that they're eating sub 1,000 calories on a regular basis. And then they just have no more calories left to manipulate. I mean, their runway is deplete. They have nowhere else to turn. So then we have to have a discussion about proper reverse dieting and slowly bringing those calories back up to then in turn ramp up their metabolic rate, put them in a position to build more lean muscle tissue, and then do that for long enough so that they're in a healthy spot and a healthy foundation, so they then can at some point in the future go back into a caloric deficit. But that's a hard conversation to have. I mean, when somebody comes to me wanting to lose weight and I've got to explain to them, hey, look, you're probably not going to lose weight for a while. In fact, you may actually gain weight as we increase calories, but we have to do that because you've left us no choice. That's a hard sell for me as a coach, but it's so necessary.
Yeah, I have that conversation with people as well. And it's called reverse dieting. Is that what you call it?
Yeah, reverse dieting. It's basically the reverse of dieting. So dieting typically being defined as bringing calories down. Reverse dieting is bringing calories back up.
Yeah. And so I see this with people too, that we start to nourish them. We start to get them eating full meals instead of just picking on a few things throughout the day. They're upping their fats, they're upping their proteins. And I say that typically what we see is some rebound weight gain, because you're going to be eating more calories, more food than normal. But what tends to happen is that your body will hopefully after that process be very nourished, and it's starting to be like, okay, the metabolism's turning back online. I have all the nutrients I need. Now I can start to let go of some things, because another thing that happens in this chronic calorie restriction that you mentioned, it's a stressor on the body. So the body thinks that there's not enough food around. So it's going to go into this mode of conservation. It's going to just hold on to every single thing you're eating because it thinks it's not getting enough. Is that sort of accurate as to what you see as well?
Yeah, and what's worse is that like when you are chronically restricting, your body's going to start tapping into whatever lean mass you have, because you're likely not going to be able to, lift at a very high volume, very high intensity. So once that becomes the case, your body's going to start becoming catabolic towards the muscle tissue that you do have. So if you're in a, chronically restricted state and you're losing lean mass, and then you wind up eventually increasing your calories, you're going to wind up with less lean mass than you started with. So then that's obviously not good for your metabolic rate. The less lean mass you have, the lower your metabolic rate is to begin with. So it just becomes a negative feedback loop through and through. I mean, there's benefits to being in a caloric deficit for a finite period of time in a very strategic manner, but to, just spend all of your time there is very counterproductive.
Yeah. So can you, for those people who are maybe unfamiliar, we talk about calories in, calories out. That's this like outdated dogma that some people are still believing in. And then, but calories do matter, right? And then there's the hormonal approach, and sort of what's the blend of these two that you really see is the most, sort of the most relevant?
Yeah. So I don't think that it could be defined as, one or the other. I feel like
Right.
it's a both and kind of situation. I mean, there are people on both ends of the spectrum that say, and you've got your hardcore keto zealots, so to speak, that say, look, calories don't matter at all. Don't worry about calories, eat everything in the world and everything's going to be, peaches and cream. And you've got people that are like, look, calories are all that matters. Calories in, calories out. Don't really worry about the types of foods you're eating. Just eat the right amount of calories and you'll be fine. And as is true with most things in life, the answer lies somewhere in the middle. So really prioritizing foods that optimize your hormone function, fully nourish your body, and give you the fuel necessary to perform optimally, but with the right caloric intake for the goal is kind of the blend. I mean, I don't feel like there needs to be a one or the other. If people viewed that as a both and scenario, they're probably going to see a lot more progress towards their goals.
Yeah, I love that. And I would agree with that too. So I personally came from I sort of swung, I learned about calories in, calories out. Then I was in the paleo world, and in the paleo world in 2013, that was where they were like, calories don't matter. So I just ate unrestricted, and I didn't know what macros were because that wasn't talked about in 2013 in my world. And so I just ate all the things, and I was like, cool, a whole plantain fried in coconut oil with cinnamon, like with my dinner. Perfect. Like that's no problem. I didn't see any issues with this. And I finally embraced fat, but also was still overeating carbohydrates because I had this massive sweet tooth and my blood sugar was unstable. So now I was eating high fat, high carbs, and not surprisingly, I started gaining a lot of weight. So what is the calorie, like where do calories factor in? Because it's like we should be in a deficit, but we can't be, like, so how do you sort of manage that?
Yeah. So from a very high level view, I typically view my compositional goals as being in either a building phase or a cutting phase. There's benefits to prioritizing one of those phases. Like everybody comes to me and says, hey, I want to build muscle and lose fat. Okay. Yeah. Duh. Everybody wants to do that. But you can't really optimize for one another simultaneously, because to optimize for building muscle, you ideally need to be in somewhat of a caloric surplus. So you're taking in enough fuel and amino acids to build more muscle tissue. If you're trying to optimize for fat loss, you ideally need to be in a caloric deficit so that your body is tapping into stored fat and depleting those storage, that adipose tissue. So ideally, optimizing for one and then the other is going to be more efficient than trying to do both simultaneously. In the context of doing, one or the other, when I'm in a deficit, like when I'm losing body fat for a competition, I will have, depending on where I'm at in that phase, I'll have ample protein, ample dietary fat, and very minimal carbohydrates. And I'll do very minimal carbohydrates in the building phase as well. A lot of people make the mistake kind of going back to your paleo days. If you're having a ton of energy coming in the form of both carbohydrates and fat, that's probably not optimal, especially if you're trying to optimize from a fat adapted, metabolism standpoint. Doing more of a ketogenic diet, you're not going to want to have an influx of carbohydrates. And if you're trying to do more of a carbohydrate-based diet, you probably don't want to have just a massive bolus of fat because it's going to be just unnecessary caloric intake. Protein is not a great substrate for energy. Protein is incredibly imperative for building and repairing your muscle tissue. But from an energy standpoint, through gluconeogenesis, is a pretty inefficient process for driving energy for the body. So if you're going to have energy, it's going to be coming from either fats or protein, or fats or carbohydrates rather. For me, I've gravitated towards the fat approach. So I'll keep carbohydrates minimal, and then I'll, depending on my goals, manipulate protein and manipulate dietary fat. But you want to just have that ratio dialed in that's going to be best suited for your goals, and not have this massive influx of both carbohydrates and fat.
Yeah, that was definitely a mistake that I learned early on. But I like the idea that I have never heard of that before, that you can really only be working on one of those goals, either building muscle or like getting down the body fat. So what sort of recommendations would you have for someone who's wanting to build muscle?
So the main things with building muscle from a very high level view is to be in a caloric surplus, be consuming ample protein to build that muscle tissue and recover from the training, be consuming ample energy in either carbohydrates or fat based off of the type of diet you're following, to have enough energy to drive the intensity of that training. And then as far as the training is concerned, you want to be implementing progressive overload principles so that you're constantly subjecting your body to increased intensity. Usually that comes in the form of increased, weight under the bar, increased time under tension, some form of stimulus to give the body reason to adapt and grow additional muscle tissue. So for me, I'm constantly tracking my lifts. I'm constantly tracking my total volume lifted to ensure that I'm progressively overloading those muscles and giving my body reason to grow. And if I'm doing all that in the context of consuming ample calories and enough dietary protein, I build more lean muscle tissue.
Awesome. And then what about for cutting fat?
So this is when it gets a little tricky, because there's a million different ways to cut body fat. My personal way with a ketogenic approach, what I do for my competition prep and myself and my clients, is I'll typically start them at a higher fat ratio, which is and I'll start them pretty close to their maintenance intake. Honestly, I'll figure out what their maintenance intake is, start them at around that intake, but with a higher fat approach, because that's going to prioritize fat metabolism. It's going to make their body more efficient at using fat, both stored fat and dietary fat. It's going to ramp up their ketones. It's going to drop their blood glucose. It's going to keep their mood pretty stable. And then from there, week after week, I'll start dropping dietary fat while simultaneously increasing dietary protein to find that individual's own unique protein threshold. Everybody has a unique protein threshold. There's not like a generic calculator where it's going to spit out your optimal amount. People are going to be more sensitive to protein levels. You probably see this a lot, measuring blood glucose and playing around with CGMs. There's a point at which people right now assume that you can just consume protein ad libitum and you can't overconsume protein, but that's not really the case. If you're trying to optimize from a fat metabolism standpoint, there is definitely a point at which your body's taking in more protein than is optimal. So once we establish that protein threshold, I'll start dropping both protein and dietary fat, so that total calories are continuing to drop and that fat ratio is staying relatively high. At that point in the prep, we're normally about 3 to 4 months in and calories are getting pretty low. But by having that relatively high fat ratio, hormonal function stays fairly stable, and so does their mood and hunger. You're going to get hungry as the calories are dropping, but by having a higher fat ratio relative to carbohydrates or protein, for instance, that's normally a little bit more mitigated. And then as they get towards the very tail end of a cut, I'll start implementing ketogenic caloric refeeds, which is basically a singular day during the week in which calories are a little bit higher by about 30% or so, coming from both protein and dietary fat. That kind of helps from a psychological standpoint to give people a little bit of an influx in food when calories are running low. And then it also gives them a little bit of a metabolic and a hormonal bump, just kind of have that day with their intake's a bit higher. It makes the lower calories more sustainable. And then that pretty much brings them to the apex of their cut. And then from there, we start that reverse diet and get back up to a healthy maintenance, and then eventually a slight surplus. And then the process repeats itself.
Wow. And how many months at a time are you doing these sort of stints?
Yeah, so I like to budget about 4 to 6 months for a cutting period. And then after that's over, about 2 to 3 months to come back to to go back to the reverse diet phase. And then from there, I like to spend, for me personally, about 2 to 2.5 years in a building phase before I transition back into a cutting phase, which is quite long.
Yeah.
But you think about it, if you're spending, 6 months in a cutting phase, 3 months in a reverse diet phase, that's 9 months out of the year right there. And if you're trying to look better every single time you lean down, like I am for a competition, then it takes a long time to build lean muscle tissue, especially as a natural athlete. So if I spend 9 months of the year not in a caloric surplus, and then I only give myself those remaining 3 months to be in a surplus, they're not really going to build ample tissue in that 3 month span. So I need to kind of take a few years off in between dieting down so that I look better and better and better with each year that passes.
I'm sure that way also mitigates some of the stress to your body and allows also ample time for your adrenals to sort of come back online to allow you to sort of do this in a healthier way. So I like to hear that you're doing this with like a long enough period of time, because it doesn't seem like you're unhealthy and unable to continue this. It seems like the more sustainable route, because I know that so many people, especially women, go into these, bodybuilding shows and competitions, and they just completely destroy their hormones. They can do a few shows, they can do a few cycles, and every time it seems that, everyone has that story that it gets worse and worse and worse, and their hair is falling out, they lose their periods and all these things. So
Yeah. I mean, if I had to like summarize all the messages that I've been trying to send out to the public, and that's probably one of the most important and paramount. I mean, people that compete every single year, I mean, I see it. It happens all the time. I mean, they wind up looking worse and worse and worse. Their hormones start to downregulate. Their metabolic rate starts to downregulate. They wind up looking worse every time they step on stage because they don't have time to build more muscle. And going through a prep is quite catabolic if done incorrectly, so they lose muscle. So all the hard work they do is for naught. And the same is true with people that are not competing, but just trying to do like these, they're trying to lose a whole bunch of weight for a photo shoot or a wedding or the beach or whatever it may be, but they're doing so far too frequently without ample time in a surplus, and they're just selling themselves short, basically.
yeah, that's a great message. So you talked earlier about some eating disorder stuff that was happening with you, and what types of disordered eating did you maybe experience and that you see commonly in people that you work with?
So for me personally, when I did my first show in 2012, that's when I bulked up to 230, and then I did everything incorrectly. This was pre-keto. This was before I knew what the heck I was doing. I lost the 80 pounds in 12 weeks. I lost a lot of muscle with that loss. And then after the show was over, I just ate everything in sight. I mean, I literally gained 20 pounds in 24 hours. So I went from, the leanest that ever looked and just had like on this pinnacle of life because I just experienced something amazing. And then I felt like I threw it all away in an instant. And then that kind of triggered a bunch of eating and purging cycles. I felt bad about what I'd done. And then I would, not eat for days. And then I would get really hungry and I'd binge on everything. And then it just became this negative feedback loop. And that lasted for about 2 or 3 years until I pretty much discovered the ketogenic diet. And then with keto, I think one of the main takeaways from that was that I didn't feel guilty eating these foods because they were good quality foods. Like I didn't have that guilt that was associated with overindulging. I mean, yeah, I mean, you don't want to overindulge and eat a bunch of ribeyes if you have a specific body composition goal in mind, but you don't really feel near as guilty eating a little bit extra meat than you do eating a whole bunch of donuts. So that really helped mitigate that psychological response. And then I think by being a figure in the space, by being somebody that was helping people reach their goal, that kind of had a whole nother accountability factor to it because I felt like people were relying and depending on me to be a light in the darkness. And since then, I've just become so passionate about sharing what I've learned that alone has motivated me to stay the course.
That's awesome. And thank you for sharing that with us. And I had my own issues with binge eating before. And honestly, like I would call it closet eating because I mean, I guess binge eating isn't normally done out in the open, but I would feel my blood sugar was so dysregulated. And my mom had me on like a lot of calorie restriction, portion control type stuff when I was growing up in the 90s. And, no fault to her like she didn't know, she was just doing what she was being told to do, right? And so it was like, okay, you can have one Eggo waffle for breakfast, like there's no nourishment in that. And so I think that my body was really, really hungry for nourishment. And then I would have a low fat yogurt for lunch with a granola bar. Of course I was starving when I came home. There was like no protein, no fat in anything I was eating. And so I would just, raid the cabinets and eat all the like snacks and cookies and things that I could find. And then it just turned into that sort of pattern. And it wasn't all the time, but I think I was just really, really hungry. And, there is a lot of guilt and shame around that. And for the first time when I did the keto diet, I was able to eat something and not eat the whole thing. And it made me not interested. Like I didn't feel the need to do that because I felt so satiated and so nourished. And I think that a ketogenic diet, getting up these fats and getting the right amount of protein for your body is so profound because so many of us did not grow up with nearly enough of those things. It was just processed carbs all day long for me anyway. And I think it's so damaging in that way. And then you think that you don't have control, you don't have the willpower, or and it's not your fault, right? And then I can see how with your bodybuilding, how it could have gotten there because you're eating these hyper palatable foods and you can't stop and you're hungry from cutting. And so you can see how you could be in this situation, and also how the ketogenic diet is such a savior to help get you out of that sort of pattern effortlessly, right? It felt pretty effortless to be able to do that for me anyway.
Yeah.
So
It definitely, I mean, I think there's so much to be said for quality dietary fats. I mean, like when I was eating traditional bro diets and with like the chicken and rice and broccoli kind of scenario, I was hardly consuming any dietary fat. And even at the end of the day, if the calories were pretty much equated for, it's a totally different type of satiety that comes with eating ample dietary fat. And you look at it from just a male testosterone standpoint. I mean, cholesterol is a precursor to testosterone. You got to have enough dietary fat to generate that. And if you're not taking hardly any dietary fat, and your hormones are going to be in the tank, which is obviously going to have a detrimental effect towards preserving lean mass and building more lean tissue. So yeah, from a hunger satiety standpoint, from a leptin and ghrelin standpoint, from a healthy hormonal standpoint, I think having dietary fats in the equation is incredibly important.
yeah, absolutely. I would totally agree with that. And so where do you ever do like carb ups, carb cycling, carb refeeds? What does that look like for you? And maybe for your clients?
I have not had a carbohydrate meal in over 7 years, so it's been a while for me, and I don't really recommend it for my clients either. I mean, I don't want to ever play this holier than thou, keto police game. I mean, to each
Mhm.
their own. But for me, I haven't had any negative effect by not having the carbohydrates. My performance continues to improve. I feel great. I'll have clients that will stop working with me, and then they'll want to experiment, and they'll try and incorporate a bunch of carbohydrates, and they'll report back, and they're like, I just don't feel as good. I don't feel like as mentally sharp. So they'll just wind up going back to a relatively clean keto approach. There's been a lot of arguments that females need a lot more carbohydrates to help moderate hormone function, keep their cycle regular, et cetera, et cetera. But anytime I really dove into individuals' biomarkers and the research there, I feel like a lot of women are having issues with that, not so much because they're not eating carbohydrates, but more so they're just not eating enough total calories, especially if they're doing a ketogenic approach with a lot of extended fasting. They're just not getting ample fuel in, and that can absolutely have a negative effect on keeping their cycle regular.
Yeah. And, the metabolic rate does go up the week before your cycle for most women. And a lot of times people are like, oh, I'm getting hungry. I don't want to, I want to eat my normal amount. And what I say to those women is like, if you're feeling hungry, and, I don't necessarily work with people with body composition to the extent that you do, but, I'm teaching women to sort of tune into their body and listen to their hunger cues. And when you are very regulated on a ketogenic diet, and your body is feeling hungry that week and it needs to menstruate, then I say, increase the calories. And then that would be where sometimes, depending on the client, we might include some carbohydrates, but for some, it sort of triggers this spiral back into not being able to control their cravings, and the sugar addiction kind of stuff shows up. So I do see that even sometimes, like you said, I think that's a great tip, is like, just bump up the calories if you need to, and make sure you're not under eating.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, eating ample fuel solves a lot of problems.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are some of the most common body composition mistakes that people make when they're doing keto? Like, what are some common mistakes that you see if they haven't been mentioned yet?
So a lot of people assume that there needs to be this drastic shift in training styles once adopting a ketogenic diet. That's just not really the case. I mean, if you're coming from a standard American diet and then you switch to keto, you're going to experience a dip in performance, temporarily as your body learns to upregulate those metabolic pathways to shuttle ketones throughout the body more efficiently and become fat adapted. But that happens pretty efficiently if you're following the diet correctly and taking in ample electrolytes and staying hydrated. So there's no reason to really change your training drastically in that regard. I mean, people from all different types of sports backgrounds, I mean, endurance sports, very highly glycolytically demanding sports like CrossFit. Those are all things that people have been excelling in with a ketogenic approach. So there's no need to really change your training based on following a ketogenic diet. As far as big mistakes I see, people assume oftentimes that they need to take in very little dietary fat if they're trying to lose body fat. This is like a hot topic you see right now. People like, if you're trying to lose body fat, then you don't need much plate fat. But the problem with that is it's kind of an oversimplification of how the whole body and the physiology works. I mean, if you're not taking in ample dietary fat, you're going to be right back where I was before I was doing keto, and I was eating incredibly high amounts of protein, very little dietary fat. And then my hormones got all dysregulated. My satiety levels were all out of whack. You can keep your dietary fat intake relatively high still in the context of a caloric deficit if you're being strategic in how you're manipulating your macros. So I think there's just a lot of oversimplification. But at the same time, it's an interesting time to be in the keto low carb space because there's just so much conflicting information out there right now. Like people, like I got into the ketogenic nutrition space back in 2015 when there was hardly any information out about it. So I was able to kind of stay up to date on all the cutting edge information as it was coming out. For somebody that's just jumping into it right now and doing a simple Google search, like they got the work cut out for them because I wouldn't even know where to turn. It's crazy out there right now.
Yeah, for sure. And I hear that too. A lot of people are like, oh, don't eat a lot of fat. There's the protein modified sparing, whatever, the fasting.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I see it's like, well, if we're not eating that much fat, then it turns into Atkins, doesn't it? It's like
it turns into Atkins. It turns into, I mean, like this super high protein, very low carb, very low fat approach is just, I mean, you're not going to feel good on it. Like these, I'm not a fan of protein sparing modified fast at all. People kind of give me a hard time because they know I'm not a fan of it because most of the recommendations for it are, sub 1000 calories, like oftentimes as low as 600 calories, incredibly high protein, very, very low carbohydrate and fat. And it's just not sustainable. Anything that's not sustainable is not really going to get my vote of confidence because at the end of the day, no matter what diet you're following, you need to be able to sustain it. You need to be able to play the long game with it and it not be just this, misery that you're going through to reach the desired outcome. So I'm not a fan of these crash diets. I'm not a fan of these diets that are incredibly restrictive to the point that people just suffer throughout it. So yeah, you gotta be strategic in how you go about your nutrition.
Yeah. So you wouldn't look at something like that as like a temporary protocol to help like reach a goal. So for several, maybe like 2 days of the week, do that or something like that.
That's how it's ideally designed and kind of prescribed. But what happens is not like that. What happens is people do that. They lose a little bit of weight. Then they get all excited because they lost a little bit of weight and they start overdoing it. Human psychology is weird. Humans aren't really good at following directions. They're kind of extremists, they're all in or all out. So like they'll do these PSMF diets and it's supposed to be, 1 day a week with the other days of the week being relatively high in calories, but they'll wind up just keeping that baseline caloric intake lower and lower and lower. And they'll start doing these PSMF low days more and more frequently. And it winds up, defaulting to an incredibly low average intake over time, which is kind of right back where we started off with this conversation, just chronically under eating.
Yeah, I hear that. So is there any other mistake that you see people make when doing keto when it comes, you mentioned you don't need to change your training, don't undereat fat because we still need the fats. And then, you'll also see a lot of blood sugar problems. You won't have a lot of energy because you're lowering both of the possible energy sources. Is there anything else that you wanted to throw in there?
Honestly, just prioritizing really quality foods. I mean, there's so many keto products out there now, many of which just use very cheap ingredients, filler ingredients that are not yielding any, optimized performance outcome. And I really just want to sway people away from that. I mean, and I even have a food product. Like the Keto Brick is a manufactured food product. It uses all high quality ingredients. And I don't want this to be like a bias or like a sell towards that by any means, but I'll be the first to tell people always prioritize single ingredient, wholesome, nutritionally dense foods. I mean, at the end of the day, that's how I would define a ketogenic diet. A well formulated ketogenic diet is a high quality, single ingredient, nutrient dense food diet in which you're consuming higher dietary fats, optimal levels of protein, and very minimal carbohydrates. And if you do that, that's kind of like the classic 80-20 analysis right there. Like you're going to get 80% of your gain from 20% of your effort.
Yeah, I love that. And that is also what I talk about and preach on this show as well, because I come from a real food background and functional nutritional therapy, and we use food as medicine to heal the body. And if it comes in a package and that's what you're getting the bulk of your calories from, the bulk of your diet from, our bodies weren't designed to recognize things like that. And I think that there are a time and a place for certain packaged foods, like, the Keto Brick and certain other, high quality ingredient foods when you're traveling, when you're, bulking up for a show or some certain instances, but you definitely want to be getting cooking the vast majority of your food from home so you can control what, oils are going in there, what ingredients, what additives, and then the cross contamination that messes up my stomach every single time I go out. So, and I wanted to sort of end on maybe some misconceptions about, or if you could tell us your theories and knowledge about maybe some lifting versus cardio in terms of building muscle. Like, where does cardio fit into the equation?
Yeah, so it's interesting. A lot of people, I don't know where this started from, but a lot of people assume that when you're trying to lose body fat, you should ramp up cardio drastically. And then as far as your lifting goes, you want to lower the weight and do more reps to get toned. That's what the general, consensus is.
Yeah.
But that's totally backwards. I mean, in reality, from a cardio standpoint, I like to treat cardio as a minimum viable dose, so to speak. So most of the manipulations come from nutritional manipulations, and then I'll start out doing very minimal amounts of cardio. And then as the body starts to plateau to the nutritional manipulations, we'll be able to just gradually, ever so slightly increase the cardio to elicit a, stimulus that causes the body to continue moving in the right direction from a compositional standpoint. If you're starting out a cut doing 7 days a week of cardio for an hour or two a day, there's not really much room to increase beyond that because you're going to just burn out on the treadmill. Whereas if you start doing, once or twice a week for like 10 minutes at a time, you can easily scale that up with, increased frequency, increased duration, increased intensity to keep things moving in the right direction. So using cardio as a trick up your sleeve, minimum viable dose, so to speak. When it comes to training, resistance training, you don't want to transition to a deficit and then do much less weight at a much higher rep count, because what happens is your body in the state of being in a deficit is looking for ways to make up that void that is present as a result of eating less food. And if you no longer demand your muscle tissue to be able to lift those heavy loads, it's going to start becoming catabolic towards that lean tissue because it's very energy demanding. It's a high energy currency, basically. So if you can continue to demand that muscle to you're required to lift those heavy loads by continuing to lift heavy in the state of a deficit, you'll be much more anti-catabolic and preserve more of that lean mass.
Wow, that's really interesting. I'm sort of going through some of that. I feel like lean mass loss right now because I've had an injury since February in my traps. And I have not been able to do significant working out because I feel like everything requires holding something, picking something up. I can't even load plates onto a machine to lift. So this is my own stress that I'm going through right now, but I feel very limited in what I can do. So I'm just starting to get back into the gym because it's just taking forever to get ready, like to get better, trying to give it time to rest. It's never getting better, but I feel like I'm getting so fluffy and I hate it. And so I'm just like, I need to get better soon. And I'm just trying to do anything I can to, not lose as much muscle as I feel like I'm starting to lose because it's mid-April and it's been a minute since I've been picking up a weight. So I can't wait to get back to it.
Yeah, well, definitely keep me posted on that. Hopefully you have a full recovery and you don't lose much. I mean, the body is incredibly adaptable. So like if you've got that muscle tissue now, if you bring that stimulus back into the equation, I mean, muscle memory is a legitimate thing. So you'll be able to keep up with that for sure.
Yeah. And I always feel thankful that, when I've had to take times off, like when my adrenals were super shot at the end of last year, and then I got COVID, and then I took a break. And then of course I went back to working out and overdid it and injured myself. That's like my classic, little pattern that I get into, is that I'm like, I can do this because my muscles are still there and I'm still strong, but I don't have the same mobility in my joints, and then I don't have the same endurance. So I think I can do the same, and then I end up hurting myself, and then I have to take time off. So it's been a mission ever since COVID started to like really find that consistency again because of these injuries. But I do find that every time I get back into it, it just takes a few days. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm lifting heavier than I was before. I don't know how it happens, but it happens every time, that I feel like even though I've taken this time off, I can actually still ramp up every time, which feels kind of good.
Yeah, and so much of it's in the head too. Like if I take a few days off, I just feel like I'm wasting away into nothing, but I know that's not the case. And as soon as you get the blood flowing again, like your muscle volumizes and you feel filled out and you get your shape back, and it's all good again. But not being in the gym is not good.
Yeah. Yeah. It's also not good for my mental health. I'm getting outside, walking, but there's only so much walking you can do when you're someone who likes to pick up heavy things. So I'm definitely
Totally.
looking forward to that. And I'm also looking forward to getting to the root of some of my thyroid stuff, because I think that's blocking me from dropping some body fat. Do you see any thyroid issues or other hormonal issues interfere with some of the goals of your clients?
Yeah, especially if they kind of going back to what we're saying, have been chronically under eating. I find
Mhm.
that when most people go through a healthy cycle of being in a cutting phase and then, supporting that with a healthy building phase, those are typically mitigated. But, if you're having those issues right now, getting that worked out, maybe not going into a cut is going to be better for you. Like if your hormones are already shot, your thyroid numbers are out of whack, and you're metabolically unsound, you're probably not going to want to transition right into a cut. So making sure you've got a healthy foundational base to begin at the onset is key for sure.
Got it. Yeah. I'm personally just suspecting some thyroid issues and heavy metals, just kind of going down that rabbit hole, but nothing severe, but kind of, I feel like it's always just that suboptimal. It's just like right on that threshold where, if I went to Western medicine, they'd be like, you're fine, but it's not optimal. And I like to be optimal. So just kind
Yeah,
of digging
optimal
through
is
that.
always the goal.
Yeah.
Mediocre, but nobody wants to be average.
Right. Right. So where can people find you?
So ketosavage.com on the website, and Keto Savage on social. If they type in that, they'll find me.
Awesome. And we will both be presenting at KetoCon, so I'll get to see you there in July. I'm really excited about that. Will you be at Paleo FX?
What month is that?
It's this month. It's in 2 weeks.
Yeah, so we're having a baby in 2 weeks, so probably
Oh
not going to make it to
my
that.
gosh. Oh,
Yeah,
congratulations. That's so exciting. Well,
we're
enjoy
stoked.
your baby. And I will be at Paleo FX, but you'll be doing something very, very exciting. So that's
Yeah,
awesome.
thank you.
So yeah, we'll link to all your information in the show notes, and look forward to hearing from you again.
Thanks so much. Keep in touch for sure.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Bye.